On a heavy July morning in 1917, behind drawn shades in a Louisville townhouse, the richest woman in the American South lay gasping for breath. Mary Lily Kenan, Flagler Bingham, 50 years old and already twice a wife, rested against a bank of pillows, her once celebrated beauty blurred by illness and morphine. At her bedside stood a doctor with his black leather bag, and beside him her new husband, Judge Robert Worth Bingham, his hand on the carved bedpost, his eyes fixed on the woman whose fortune could change his life. The room itself was not grand. The curtains were drawn to keep out the Kentucky sun, turning the air thick and close. A small fan ticked in the corner, stirring little more than the faint odor of carbolic and stale linen. Glass medicine vials glinted on a bedside table. A few roses, already wilting, drooped in a water glass. Outside, streetcars rattled along 4th Street carrying ordinary Louisvillians about their business, unaware that behind this brick facade, the vast wealth of the Flagler Empire hovered on the edge of a single fragile heartbeat. Far away, 1,000 miles to the south, another house waited in a very different silence. On the narrow island of Palm Beach, the great marble palace called Whitehall stood locked for the summer. Its porte-cochere, built for carriages and then for motor cars, was empty. The double doors, bronzed and ornamented, were bolted against the Atlantic heat. Within, sunlight fell in slanting shafts through stained glass onto a grand hall of polished marble, its columns veined like ice, its coffered ceiling picked out in gold leaf. Dust motes floated where once ladies' gowns had brushed past in a rustle of silk. Whitehall had been Henry Flagler's tribute to his third wife, Mary Lily, a wedding gift some 20 rooms larger than the White House. In winter seasons before the war, orchestras had played beneath its crystal chandeliers, while the cream of American society promenaded along its loggias, the sea breeze mingling with cigar smoke and orange blossom. Now, in the off-season, only a skeleton staff remained. Protective covers shrouded the furniture like ghostly forms. The marble floors, recently waxed by sighing maids, gleamed without a single footprint. An ocean wind pressed at the shuttered windows, but there was no mistress to open them. Back in Louisville, that absence was expressed in another way. Mary Lily's famous chestnut hair, once arranged for receptions in Whitehall's drawing room, was braided simply against the pillow. Her nightgown clung damply to her skin. Each breath came with a faint rattle. The physician, accustomed to late-night calls and desperate families, moved with practiced calm. Morphine was his chief ally, one of the few reliable comforts left to a doctor in an era before antibiotics, before modern cardiology. If he misjudged the dose, it was not only pain that might be eased. The judge watched closely as the syringe emptied into her arm. Robert Bingham had married her scarcely a year earlier, stepping from the respectable but modest world of a Kentucky jurist into the dazzling penumbra of Flagler money. He had known poverty as a young man, had buried one wife already, and had remade himself as a reform-minded public figure. Now, as his second wife's pulse fluttered beneath the doctor's fingers, he stood to inherit a position among the nation's wealthiest men, a prospect both unimaginable and, to some, deeply suspicious. Only weeks earlier, Mary Lily's lawyers had drawn up a new codicil to her will. The original document, crafted after Henry Flagler's death, had reflected both sentiment and strategy. Much of her fortune was to pass eventually to the Kenan clan of North Carolina, the sprawling family from which she had sprung. Trusts, annuities, and carefully phrased bequests were designed to preserve Flagler wealth for generations yet unborn. Bingham, as the second husband, had been remembered generously but not lavishly, with income for life rather than outright control. The codicil changed that balance. It increased the judge's share, converting some income interests into direct inheritance, and gave him broader authority over valuable securities. Signed while her health was faltering, it was presented as a natural correction, an act of affection by a woman who wished to secure her husband's future. Yet in Wilmington and Chapel Hill, among the Kenan siblings who had watched Mary Lily rise from provincial girlhood to Palm Beach royalty, unease began to stir. They spoke of headaches, of nervous collapses, of too many vials near the sickbed. They noted the timing. They wondered, quietly at first, if everything about their sister's final months had been as it seemed. In those murmured questions lay an uncomfortable contrast. On the one hand, there was the medical reality of 1917, diagnoses based on the ear and the hand rather than on x-rays and lab tests, a medicine chest stocked more with opiates and tonics than with cures. Women of 50, worn by years of social obligation and private strain, did die suddenly. Heart disease, kidney failure, infection, any might be fatal, and the doctor's certificate would tell only part of the story. On the other hand, there was motive. A fortune measured in tens of millions, a new husband whose political ambitions exceeded his bank account, a hastily signed codicil. In such a setting, even ordinary medical decisions could start to look like something darker. The distance between Whitehall and that Louisville bedroom was not only geographic. It was the distance between the public theater of Gilded Age wealth and the private rooms where its human cost was paid. In Florida, carved marble mantles waited for fires that would never be lit. Tapestries hung in silence. The great music room, where chamber orchestras had played Mozart for guests in diamonds and white tie, was now so quiet that one could imagine hearing the faint crash of waves beyond the seawall. The house, conceived as a monument to love and success, had become a hollow shell, more mausoleum than home. In Kentucky, by contrast, things were crowded and close. A nurse hovered. A lawyer came and went, his presence raising eyebrows among the servants. A messenger boy carried notes across town. Though the curtains were drawn, the outside world seeped in. The news of soldiers shipping out for Europe, the price of coal, the whispers of neighbors. Wealth on the scale did not allow for a purely private death. Every decision, every signature, every dose of medicine would be parsed, second-guessed, and, in time, litigated. Did Mary Lily simply succumb to the ailments of her age and era, her body exhausted by years spent under the weight of enormous social and financial responsibility? Or, somewhere in this tangle of devotion and self-interest, was a line crossed, a pill given too often, a dose of morphine allowed to drift from comfort toward quietus? Medicine in 1917 could not answer those questions with certainty. The law, as it would turn out, would not settle them entirely either. What is clear is that the fortune at stake did not come free. It had been amassed in railroad rights-of-way and hotel kitchens in the sweat of workers who laid track through swamps and served dinner under electric chandeliers. It had shaped towns and coasts, reputations and rivalries. By the time Mary Lily lay dying in that dim Louisville room, every dollar was entangled with expectations of the Kenans who saw themselves as rightful heirs, of the Binghams who glimpsed a different future, of communities in Florida and Kentucky whose institutions might be transformed by a single bequest. As her breathing grew shallower and the doctor bent once more to his task, the contrast between the glittering palace in Palm Beach and the suffocating little bedroom in Louisville could not have been starker. One represented the face that Gilded Age wealth had shown to the world, marble, music, and the shimmer of ocean light on polished stone. The other revealed what that wealth often concealed: frailty, dependence, suspicion, and the quiet terror of a death that might not be as simple as it seemed. To understand how this moment came to pass, and what price would be paid by everyone drawn into its orbit, we must step back from that sickbed, away from the shuttered windows and the waiting lawyers, and return to the beginnings of the fortune that made such a death so consequential. Long before a doctor uncapped his morphine vial in that dim Louisville bedroom, another scene had unfolded under a very different southern sky. In the flat coastal plain of North Carolina, where live oaks dragged their branches through sandy soil and rice fields once gleamed under the sun, the Kenan family held court at places like Liberty Hall. Their house at Kenansville was no palace, but it possessed the quiet assurance of old Southern respectability. Broad verandas, high-ceilinged rooms shaded by jalousies, portraits of grim-faced ancestors watching from gilt frames. Before the Civil War, such homes were sustained by land, by enslaved labor, and by a code of honor that prized lineage as much as ready cash. After the war, the land remained, but the money did not. The soil still baked under the same sun, yet mortgages crept in where once there had been unencumbered acres, and the Kenans, like so many of their class, learned to live on memories as much as income. Mary Lily Kenan was born into this altered world in 1867, 2 years after Appomattox, when the smoke had cleared but the South's future was still in doubt. Her parents, William Rand Kenan and Mary Hargrave, belonged to that layer of society sometimes called planter gentry, comfortable but never fabulously rich, proud of their revolutionary forebears and their Presbyterian piety. In Wilmington, where the family settled, the Kenan name opened doors at church and in drawing rooms, but it did not guarantee the effortless abundance their grandparents had known. Silver might be polished for company, yet a leaking roof might go untended for another season. The war had left warehouses burnt, banknotes worthless, and a certain reticence hanging over talk of money. For girls like Mary Lily, the path forward lay not in restoring vanished plantations, but in cultivating qualities that still had currency, refinement, education, and a mannerly grace that spoke of better days. She was, by all accounts, a serious child with a musical ear and a deep religious streak. At the Wilmington Presbyterian Church, she absorbed sermons about duty and charity. At home, she practiced on the piano until her fingers ached, filling the parlor with hymn tunes and polite parlor pieces. Compared with the daughters of New York industrialists, her upbringing was modest. There were no Paris dressmakers, no private rail cars, no winters at foreign spas. Instead, there were careful economies, shared dresses among sisters, and the quiet discipline of a household determined to live as though nothing essential had changed. The Kenans entertained visiting ministers rather than Wall Street bankers. Conversations turned on theology, family histories, and the slow rebuilding of Southern society. In that environment, wealth was spoken of less as an achievement than as a trust, something to be used with discretion and, above all, with propriety. 1,000 miles to the north, another child of the 19th century was absorbing a very different set of lessons. Henry Flagler was born in 1830 in the small upstate New York town of Hopewell, the son of a struggling Presbyterian minister and a German-born mother who kept the family afloat by running a boarding house. From an early age, he understood that gentility without money meant hardship. Formal schooling gave way to work. At 14, he was clerking in a grain store in Ohio, learning to read not Latin and Greek, but prices, risk, and the moods of the market. Where a Kenan might talk of ancestors, young Flagler learned to talk of margins. He married, failed in business, tried again, and finally struck fertile ground in Cleveland's booming grain and whiskey trade. It was there, through a network of suppliers and creditors, that he met a fellow striver named John D. Rockefeller. The partnership they forged would redefine American wealth. Flagler, with his talent for organization and finance, became the indispensable architect behind Rockefeller's vision for Standard Oil. In 1870, the company was formally organized, and over the next decade, it wove an unprecedented web of refineries, pipelines, and secret rebates with the railroads. Where the Kenans' prosperity had once depended on the fertility of a few thousand acres, Flagler's grew from controlling the arteries of a new industrial nation. Oil flowed, dividends followed. By his 50s, he could count his fortune in the tens of millions, though exact figures were known only to a few. Yet with success came sorrows. His first wife, Mary Harkness, grew frail and died in 1881, and their daughter carried the burden of chronic illness. Restless, grieving, and already too wealthy to be truly at home in Cleveland, Flagler began looking southward toward a winter climate that might ease both body and mind. Florida, when Flagler first visited in the early 1880s, was more frontier than playground. St. Lyde, Augustine was a sleepy relic of Spanish days. Its narrow streets lined with coquina walls and orange trees, its wooden boarding houses offering little to tempt the New York elite. Flagler, with the eye of a builder, saw something else, a blank canvas. If good hotels could be raised and reliable railroads laid, he believed, the same class of people who filled Newport's cottages might be persuaded to winter along Florida's shores. What followed was a second career as extraordinary as his first. Flagler poured millions into the Florida East Coast Railway, inching tracks down through palmetto scrub and across rivers that had never seen an iron bridge. Along the way, he planted a chain of grand hotels, the Ponce de Leon in St. Nede, Augustine, the Royal Poinciana, and later Whitehall in Palm Beach, that combined Moorish towers, Tiffany glass, and the latest conveniences of electricity and telephones. This was not inherited leisure. It was engineered luxury, modern, efficient, and unapologetically commercial. By the late 1880s, the currents of these two worlds were starting to meet. Northern capital was creeping into southern railroads and mills. Southern families, their fortunes diminished, were sending sons and daughters north to schools and resorts. The Kenans were among them. Relatives traveled, sat on boards, and accepted invitations to winter in St. Augustine or Palm Beach, where Flagler's hotels quickly became crossroads for the nation's ruling class. Precisely when Mary Lily first met the magnate is uncertain, but by the mid-1890s she was part of the circle around his Florida enterprises, a quiet southern lady in her 20s, welcomed at musicales and teas for her poise, her piano playing, and the unforced piety that reminded Flagler of his own simpler youth. One obstacle remained. Flagler's second wife, Ida Alice Shorts, a former nurse whose mind had broken. Declared insane and confined, She could not be a partner, yet church doctrine still bound husband to wife. For years, Flagler, guided by sympathetic pastors and lawyers, pressed Florida's legislature to recognize incurable insanity as grounds for divorce. When the statute was amended in 1901, he secured a decree, settled support on Ida Alice, and within months, married 34-year-old Mary Lily in her Wilmington church. Admirers called it providence and companionship. Critics saw power-bending law and pulpit, and a devout Southern heiress stepping uneasily into the dazzling, compromised light of American fortune. From the window of a southbound train in the 1890s, Florida looked less like a destination than a dare. Mile after mile of palmetto scrub and pine forest slid past, broken by stretches of marsh where herons stalked in the shallows and the horizon dissolved into sky. To most Americans, this lower half of the peninsula was a blank space on the map, a place of mosquitoes, alligators, and scattered fishing shacks. To Henry Flagler, by then in his 60s and already fabulously wealthy from oil, it was an unfinished project. Steel rails, he believed, could turn this nowhere into a chain of somewheres, a winter world of hotels, gardens, and verandas where northern money would follow the sun. He began cautiously. In the late 1880s, his Florida East Coast Railway extended only as far as St. Augustine, where the Ponce de Leon Hotel rose like a Spanish fantasy of towers, arcades, and electric lights. When that gamble paid off, he pushed farther, buying up small, struggling local lines and splicing them together into a single artery that crept down the coast. Ormond, Daytona, Rockledge, each new terminus saw a hotel, a pier, and a modest village swell around the station. Critics dismissed the enterprise as Flagler's folly, a railroad to nowhere built through swamps and sand. Yet with each season more Pullman cars unloaded, ladies in furs and men in straw boaters, and the nowhere began to acquire names, streets, and land values. By 1893, his surveyors were eyeing one of the strangest prospects of all, a long, narrow barrier island separated from the mainland by a lagoon called Lake Worth. Locals knew it as a remote strip of coconut groves and scrub, dotted with a few pioneer homesteads and the rough camps of fishermen who pulled their skiffs across the lake. There were no roads, only sand tracks, and no bridge at all. But the island's ocean breeze, its mile after mile of untouched beach, and its position just far enough from frost drew Flagler's imagination. If he could bring the railroad to the western shore of Lake Worth and then ferry guests across by launch, he could create something rarer than another resort town, a truly exclusive winter enclave, cut off by water from the ordinary world. On the mainland, at what would become West Palm Beach, Flagler laid out streets, depots, and service yards, the backstage machinery for the island fantasy to come. Across the lagoon, carpenters hacked at the undergrowth and surveyed sites for what would be, for a time, the largest hotel in the world, the Royal Poinciana. When it opened in 1894, its long, rambling wooden wings stretched for more than a quarter of a mile along the lakeshore, painted a cheerful yellow and crowned with red roofs. Guests stepped from the little railway station to lounges that carried them over to a dock lined with palms, and from there into a world of wicker furniture, rocking chairs, and verandas fragrant with jasmine. A few years later, he would add the Palm Beach Inn on the ocean side, soon known as the Breakers, after a fire, and rebuild, offering guests a choice between lake breezes and surf. Palm Beach's social code was as carefully engineered as its timetables. Strict dress at dinner, segregated spaces for staff, and an almost invisible color line. Within a decade, it had become a winter capital for millionaires. A place where the same families who summered in Newport now play golf, rode in carriages along Ocean Boulevard, and exchanged calling cards beneath the fronds. It was into this constructed paradise that Mary Lily Kenan stepped as a visitor in the 1890s, and then, after her 1901 wedding, as its unofficial queen. For years, Flagler had stayed at his own hotels, occupying a suite like any other guest. With his marriage to a much younger Southern bride and his advancing age, he wanted something different, a house that would signal permanence rather than experiment, that would match the splendor of his hotels but belong wholly to him and to her. Around 1900, he resolved to build what he called a winter cottage on the island, a private residence that would dwarf most public buildings. For the design, he turned not to local builders, but to one of the most fashionable architectural firms in New York, Carrere and Hastings, the Beaux-Arts masters then completing the New York Public Library and clubhouses for the city's most exclusive gentlemen. Their canvas was a waterfront parcel on the lake side of Palm Beach, facing the calm intracoastal waterway rather than the open Atlantic. The house they conceived would cover roughly 100,000 square feet, arranged around a vast central hall and flanked by galleries and wings in a severe but lavish classical style. From the street, visitors would see a symmetrical facade of creamy stucco, rusticated at the base and crowned with balustrades and urns, its bronze steps rising to a porte-cochere sized for the grandest carriages and, increasingly, for motor cars. The architects called the style American Renaissance, but to most, it reads simply as opulence, a palace posing, a bit ironically, as a seasonal retreat. Inside, Carrere and Hastings used space the way a composer uses sound, moving guests from intimacy to spectacle and back again. The front doors opened directly into the double-height Grand Hall, a vast, marble-floored space that served as both entrance and statement. Corinthian columns rose to a coffered ceiling gilded in gold leaf, while a great central fireplace, more symbolic than practical in Florida's mild winters, anchored the far end. From here, broad staircases swept upward, inviting the eye and the guest to ascend. To one side lay a Louis XV-inspired drawing room, where pale paneling, mirrored walls, and delicate boiserie evoked the salons of pre-revolutionary Paris. Gilded console tables and silk-upholstered chairs were arranged not haphazardly, but in conversational clusters that suggested easy sociability, even as servants moved silently along hidden doors. On the other side of the hall, an Italian Renaissance-themed music room and ballroom projected a different mood, heavier, more formal, with painted ceilings, rich draperies, and space enough for an orchestra at one end. Here, under electric chandeliers and within earshot of the surf, Mary Lily could preside at her piano or at a reception line, embodying both her Kenan refinement and her husband's baronial scale. Long loggias stretched along the lakefront, colonnaded verandas where wicker chairs and potted palms framed views of the water and the mainland beyond. These outdoor rooms were essential to the house's choreography. Guests might move from the dazzle of the grand hall to the softness of filtered light under the arches, from there to gardens and yacht landings, always accompanied by the sound of rustling palm fronds and the low thrum of engines in the distance. If the public face of Whitehall was all flowing movement and sun-drenched ease, its making was anything but effortless. Palm Beach was, at bottom, a sandbar. To support a 100,000-square-foot masonry structure, engineers had to drive pilings deep into the porous ground and design foundations that would withstand not only the weight of marble and tile, but the occasional fury of Atlantic storms. Trainloads of materials arrived daily at the West Palm Beach railhead, Vermont, and Italian marble, cast iron fittings, New York-made hardware, mahogany from Central America, and barrels of Portland cement. From there, barges and small steamers ferried cargo across Lake Worth to temporary docks near the site, where teams of laborers unloaded them plank by plank. On the island itself, an army of craftsmen went to work. Plasterers modeled ceilings and cornices in elaborate patterns of scrolls and shells. Carpenters framed roof trusses and paneled libraries in dark woods that had never grown within 1,000 miles. Electricians threaded miles of copper wire through walls and ceilings, connecting Whitehall to generators and switchboards tucked out of sight. Telephone lines were run not just to the local exchange, but between the house's own rooms, allowing mistress, butler, and kitchen to coordinate without the spectacle of shouted orders. Perhaps most ambitious of all, Carrere and Hastings specified central heating radiators discreetly massed behind grills and fed by boilers so that the Flaglers and their guests could be as comfortable on a rare chilly evening in Palm Beach as in any Fifth Avenue townhouse. All of this had to function in a climate that warred against it. Humidity swelled doors and invited mold into even the finest plaster. Salt air corroded metal fastenings and dulled gilt. Storm tides threatened to undercut seawalls and flood basements where servants slept and machinery hummed. Whitehall's elegance depended on an understory of constant repair, painters touching up peeling window frames, gardeners replacing storm-battered plantings, mechanics cleaning and oiling the hidden heart of the house. Below the level of the Grand Hall's marble floor ran a parallel world of service corridors, pantries, boiler rooms, and servant staircases, spaces sized for labor rather than for display. The financial outlay for this cottage ran into the millions, a sum that would have rescued several old plantation families from ruin. Yet to visiting friends it was meant to seem as natural and unstrained as sunlight on water. Guests arriving by rail and launch saw only the final effect, the drive curving through manicured lawns, the doors swinging open at their approach, The air cool despite the afternoon heat, lamps glowing at the touch of a switch. The railroad to nowhere, derided by skeptics when the first track snaked into the palmettos, had become the indispensable pipeline that fed coal, food, linens, and visitors into this improbable palace on sand. When Whitehall finally opened its doors for the 1902 season, it stood at the intersection of two ages. Its Beaux-Arts symmetry and formal rooms spoke the language of European courts and old-world ceremony. Its wiring, pipes, and dependence on timetables belonged to the new century of steam and steel. At its center was Mary Lilly, the Kenan daughter from a post-bellum parlor, now gliding through a house that could swallow Liberty Hall several times over. In her winter domains of marble and sunlight, the long journey from oil fields and ruined plantations seemed, for a moment, resolved. But even as guests applauded the illusion of effortless grace, the true weight of such a life and such a fortune was only beginning to make itself felt. In January, when the northern cities still lay under soot-gray snow, the real year for Palm Beach began with the shrill whistle of the Florida East Coast Railway. Just after noon, a private car painted in the colors of some New York or Chicago fortune would be shunted onto the siding at West Palm Beach. Porters swung open brass-trimmed doors, and ladies in travel crumpled silk stepped down into air that smelled of salt, jasmine, and coal smoke. Across the lagoon, Whitehall waited with lamps already burning. Its long loggia swept, its staff lined up along the drive. For 10 brief weeks each winter, this house, empty and echoing most of the year, became the beating heart of a carefully orchestrated world. Carriages and, increasingly, motor cars ferried the guests from the station to the little launch that crossed Lake Worth. As the boat nosed up to Whitehall's dock, the house revealed itself gradually, first the pale bulk of its facade to the palms, then the gleam of bronze doors, and finally, at the top of the steps, the small, composed figure who made this marble theater seem human. In pale linen or chiffon, her auburn hair pinned high, Mary Lilly Flagler received each arrival with a handshake and a word just intimate enough to suggest genuine pleasure. Behind her, the grand hall blazed with crystal and polished stone, yet it was her presence, soft-voiced, attentive, that told guests they had truly arrived in Palm Beach society. A typical day in season unfolded according to a rhythm as precise as any railroad timetable. Mornings began with breakfast laid out beneath the loggia arches, the lake rippling just beyond the balustrade. Liveried footmen moved among chattering groups, refilling cups as news from New York and Washington was discussed over grapefruit and hot rolls. Afterward, there were carriage drives along Ocean Boulevard, golf at the Palm Beach links, or sedate promenades in the ubiquitous wicker wheelchairs pushed by local black laborers along the shaded lake trail. By afternoon, parasols bloomed in the gardens, while bridge tables appeared in the drawing room, seating old Knickerbocker names beside Western mining barons, European viscounts, and the brash, still learning rich from Pittsburgh and Detroit. Evenings were Whitehall's true performance. By 7 o'clock, maids had drawn embroidered gowns from their camphor-scented wardrobes, valets had brushed dinner jackets, and a choir procession began to assemble at the head of the great staircase. Below, in the grand hall, the orchestra had already taken its place in the musicians' gallery, tuning discreetly. Guests ascended in twos and threes, the women's jewels catching the light from rows of crystal chandeliers. At the foot of the stairs stood Henry and Mary Lilly, he formally erect despite the stiffness in his joints, she offering each couple a few words of welcome before the butler announced their names. In the dining room, 20 or more courses might follow: oysters on ice, turtle soup, roasts, ices each borne in on a small army of white-gloved servers. To the guests, these evenings appeared as if they had sprung fully formed from the marble and gilt, inevitable as the tide. In truth, they were the result of weeks of unseen labor and a mind that never quite rested. As mistress of Whitehall, Mary Lilly kept a small writing table near a window in her boudoir, where she worked through guest lists and menus with the same quiet diligence she had once applied to her music lessons in Wilmington. Invitations had to be balanced, just enough old New York families to reassure the socially cautious, leavened with Western and Midwestern magnates whose new fortunes could not be ignored. Place cards were agonized over so that no ancient grudge or fresh rivalry might poison the conversation at table. In consultation with the French chef and the butler, she selected dishes suited to the Florida climate, lighter sauces, abundant fruits, and insisted that the flowers harmonize with both the menu and the ladies' gowns. Boxes of roses and carnations arrived by rail, cooled with blocks of ice. Local orange blossoms and hibiscus filled in the gaps, Downstairs, she moved through the kitchens and service corridors with a firm but courteous word for the staff, whose numbers swelled during the season to dozens of maids, footmen, laundresses, and gardeners, names and preferences lodged in her memory. This senator took weak tea after dinner. That banker's wife could not eat shellfish. Henry admired this competence, even as he retreated more often to his library after the main course, leaving his much younger wife to preside over coffee and cards. From a distance, theirs looked like a comfortable arrangement. The aged Titan, silver-haired and deliberate, and the gracious young wife who lent softness to his severity. Up close, it was more intricate. By the time Whitehall opened, Henry Flagler was in his 70s, his hearing not what it had been, his hands sometimes unsteady as he took Mary Lily's arm on the way to table. Rheumatism and the lingering effects of old illnesses made long evenings of conversation tiring. Business still claimed much of his attention. Even in Palm Beach, telegrams arrived daily, and there were conferences with railroad men and lawyers in his study. For Mary Lily, those closed doors and the hours he spent resting after luncheon underscored the strangeness of being both wife and, in some respects, devoted daughter to a man nearly 40 years her senior. Affection was present. Those who observed them closely spoke of small, untheatrical kindnesses. She adjusted his shawl on cool evenings along the loggia, read aloud from the Bible or from the latest novels when his eyesight tired, and listened patiently as he reminisced about the early days of Standard Oil or the perils of building across the Florida Keys. He, in turn, endowed charities dear to her and made space in his crowded schedule for the Kenan relatives who came to visit. Yet gratitude and duty threaded through that affection. Mary Lily could not easily forget that her marriage had followed a highly publicized divorce granted on religious grounds, that many in Wilmington still murmured about it, or that her role as Mrs. Flagler came at the price of never having a household, or perhaps children entirely her own. Outside the whirl of invitations and dinners, their life at Whitehall had gentler cadences. Most mornings before guests emerged, Henry and Mary Lily read scripture together in a small sitting room. The same Presbyterian habit carried south from Ohio and North Carolina alike. Later, when the house fell briefly still between luncheon and tea, she retreated to her writing desk. Letters went northward to Wilmington and Chapel Hill, full of family gossip, charitable schemes, and, occasionally, a note of homesickness she rarely voiced aloud. In the late season, when Lent thinned the calendar and trains began carrying friends back toward New York, Whitehall's echo grew more pronounced. The orchestra was dismissed. The dining table sat bare. On some of those quieter evenings, a servant passing the music room might pause to hear Mary Lily at the piano, playing hymns or Chopin to an empty house. The same walls that had reflected laughter now seemed to throw her notes back upon her. While guests at Whitehall remembered the gleam of chandeliers and the rustle of silk along its marble corridors, those impressions rested on a quieter, harder reality. Just beyond the polished doors, out of sight of the grand hall, another world hummed from before dawn until long past midnight, a world of coal dust, boiling water, laundry steam, and the steady footfalls of men and women whose names never appeared in society columns, but without whom Palm Beach's winter paradise could not have functioned at all. Architects like Carrere and Hastings understood that great houses needed great backstage spaces. At Whitehall, the servants' domain threaded through the building like a second invisible house. Beneath the main floor, a broad basement level held the beating heart of the estate. Boiler rooms, electrical switchboards, storage vaults, wine cellars, and a warren of pantries and sculleries. Narrow corridors linked these to service staircases that rose, almost secretly, to each floor. A guest stepping from her bedroom into a quiet corridor would see only a discreet door marked linen or service, unaware that behind it a maid was waiting with fresh towels, listening for the bell that summoned her. The organization of labor matched this hidden architecture. At the top of the household hierarchy stood the butler, usually a seasoned man who had served in northern houses or on transatlantic liners before accepting a winter post in Florida. He oversaw the male indoor staff footman, pantryman, the wine steward, and acted as master of ceremonies for every meal and reception. Beside him in authority, though not in visibility, was the housekeeper, typically a middle-aged woman of firm bearing who governed the army of chambermaids and parlor maids. Between them lay the responsibility for keeping perhaps 50 to 75 rooms, salons, service spaces in perfect readiness for whichever guest might appear. Days began early. Long before the first breakfast tray was carried up to a guest room, Maids in plain uniforms had climbed the back stairs to open shutters, shake out rugs, and sweep marble thresholds where the night's moisture sometimes left a film. Fires, modest but symbolic, had to be laid in ornamental grates for cool mornings. Lamps were checked, their fragile bulbs and shades wiped free of dust. In the kitchens at basement level, the chef and his assistants had been at work since dawn, coaxing temperamental coal ranges to the right heat for breads and pastries, while keeping the heavy iron stoves from overheating a room already thick with humidity. Against this, the safety and convenience of the guests seemed almost effortless. Lunch appeared precisely at 1, flowers remained fresh despite the heat, and bathtubs filled with hot water at a turn of the tap. Behind each of those comforts lay a schedule as rigid as any factory's. Ice blocks, delivered by rail from northern plants or produced in local ice houses, had to be hoisted into insulated chests before they melted in the tropical air. Bed linens, changed frequently for fastidious visitors, were carried in basket loads to a laundry where steam presses hissed and irons clanked through most waking hours. A single overlooked smudge on a napkin, an unemptied ashtray in the drawing room, or a delay in answering a bell could bring a swift rebuke, not only from guests but from the housekeeper or butler whose professional pride depended on immaculate service. Above the human labor towered the machinery that made Whitehall a rarity in its time, a fully modern house in a landscape still half wild. Great coal-fired boilers in the basement produced steam for both heating and hot water, tended by stokers whose shirts darkened with sweat even on the mildest January morning. Generators and switchboards, whether belonging to the house itself or tied into the local electric plant that served Flagler's hotels, required constant attention. Electrical systems in the early 1900s were finicky and occasionally dangerous. A stray spark or overheated wire in a building hung with silks and lined in wood could turn paradise into an inferno. Electricians and machinists, unseen by the guests chattering above, listened for the telltale hum of trouble in the dynamos. Plumbing, too, was both a marvel and a headache. Dozens of bathrooms and lavatories, luxuries in themselves at the time, demanded a steady supply of pressured water and reliable drainage. Pumps chugged in the background, raising water from cisterns or municipal mains to attic tanks. In a dry spell, gardeners and engineers negotiated over usage. Should the sprinklers run to keep lawns green, or be throttled back so that the guests' baths could remain indulgently deep? Every choice cost money, coal, and, in the case of Florida's fragile freshwater supplies, a resource whose limits were only dimly understood. Then there was the climate. For the guests, it meant gentle winters, orange blossoms, and the possibility of breakfast outdoors. For the staff tasked with preserving northern standards of cleanliness and comfort, it meant an unending campaign against heat, moisture, and decay. Mold crept into corners if walls were not wiped regularly. Silver tarnished almost faster than it could be polished under the assault of salty air. Insects slipped through the finest screening. Ants found their way to sugar bowls. Palmetto bugs startled even hardened maids in the pantries at night. Mosquitoes were more than a nuisance. In an era when yellow fever and malaria still haunted memory, kerosene was poured into standing water, and window screens mended with anxious care. Outside, the gardeners and grounds crews fought parallel battles. The lawns and flower beds that framed Whitehall's facade had no precedent on that strip of sand. Every bright bloom was the result of irrigation pipes, fertilizer deliveries, and careful coaxing. Salt spray brown leaves overnight if the wind shifted. Occasional winter storms rolled in from the Atlantic with startling force, bending palms nearly double and driving rain sideways into verandas that had to be mopped dry before guests emerged for breakfast. After each gale, crews checked the seawall, reset toppled urns, and cleared sand from the drive, restoring in a day the illusion that nature here was always gentle. The people who kept this machinery running formed a layered world of their own. Some senior servants followed the Flaglers south each winter, veterans of New York townhouses or transatlantic liners. Many more were local Floridians, white clerks, black laundresses, and gardeners whose families had fished Lake Worth or cut timber before the resorts arrived. Bahamian and Caribbean migrants filled the heaviest jobs in laundry yards and hotel kitchens. Wages ran perhaps $20 to $40 a month, with board for days that easily stretched 12 or 14 hours. White staff usually held the visible post footmen at the door, maids in the drawing rooms, while black and island workers labored in steamy basements and service yards. At night, they slept in narrow rooms under the eaves, knowing that their names would never be recorded, though every polished surface upstairs bore their quiet fingerprints. In the winter of 1913, as Whitehall opened for what no one realized would be its last true season under Henry Flagler, the house seemed to shine even more fiercely than before. Palm Beach had matured around it. The little fishing village and sand tracks of the 1890s were now a polished resort town with paved walks, yacht clubs, and shops catering to the whims of visiting millionaires. From the loggias, Henry could watch his Florida East Coast railway trains slip like steel toys along the mainland, delivering another generation of guests to the hotels and towns he had conjured from swamp and scrub. Yet inside Whitehall, the rhythm was subtly different. At 83, Flagler moved more slowly along its marble floors, leaning on a cane as he descended the great staircase, pausing to grip the balustrade while his much younger wife, Mary Lily, matched her pace to his. The empire outside was still expanding. The man at its center was plainly beginning to fade. That season's guest list was a little smaller, the entertainments less exhausting. There were still dinners for 30 in the long, mirrored dining room, still music halls in the Italianate music room where Mary Lily's hands moved gracefully over the keys. But there were more afternoons when the shutters were half drawn against the glare, and Henry rested in his library with a newspaper folded on his lap. Rheumatism stiffened his joints, and a minor stroke the year before had left him with occasional spells of dizziness that he tried hard to ignore. Doctors summoned discreetly prescribed rest and tonics. Mary Lily, who had learned the language of illness early in her marriage, adjusted the household around his limits. Receptions began earlier and ended sooner, the flow of visitors gently spaced so that the old man who had once seemed tireless would not be pushed beyond what his failing body could bear. The accident, when it came, occurred not during a grand occasion, but on an ordinary sweltering May afternoon, after most of the season's visitors had already departed north. Whitehall was quieter then, half closed against the advancing heat. Mary Lily was in her boudoir dictating correspondence when a dull, unnatural sound echoed up through the marble core of the house. A thud, then a clatter, then hurried footsteps and a maid's sharp cry. Somewhere between the mezzanine and the main floor, Henry had lost his footing on the polished airs. Whether dizziness caught him or his weakened legs simply betrayed him, no one could ever say with certainty. By the time the butler and 2 footmen reached him, he lay crumpled against the base of the balustrade, his cane flung aside, his face ashen with a combination of pain and shock that servants who witnessed it would remember to the end of their days. Doctors were summoned at once, rushing by launch from the mainland, their black bags bumping against their knees as the little boat cut across Lake Worth. Hip fractures in an 83-year-old man were grave even in the best northern hospitals. In a semi-tropical resort town in 1913, they were all but a death sentence. The physicians eased Henry onto a hastily arranged sickbed in his ground-floor bedroom, bound the broken hip as best they could, and ordered rest, elevation, and opiates for the blinding pain. Infection, that invisible shadow over every serious injury before antibiotics, soon set in. Fever flushed his face. His breathing grew labored. Whitehall's grand rooms fell silent as servants padded softly about their work, aware that their employer's world had narrowed to a single, shuttered chamber where Mary Lily kept vigil, reading psalms aloud in the evening, moistening his lips and signing increasingly on his behalf. On May 20th, 1913, after days of drifting in and out of consciousness, Henry Morrison Flagler died in that bedroom, with Mary Lily and a handful of doctors and attendants at his side. Outside, the palms along the drive moved gently in the morning breeze. Somewhere across the lagoon, a train whistle sounded for the noon departure. Bound north along the rails, he had driven through wilderness. News of his passing flashed by telegraph to New York, Cleveland, Jacksonville. Newspapers that had once mocked his Florida schemes now hailed him as a builder of empires and father of the East Coast. Within days, his body embalmed and placed in a flag-draped casket was carried by special train from Palm Beach to St. Liebling. Augustine, the first of his Florida creations. Towns along the route dimmed their lights and drew their blinds as the cars rolled past, a moving funeral procession through a landscape he had remade. Before the casket was lowered into the family mausoleum at Memorial Presbyterian Church, another of Flagler's creations was already beginning to stir, the legal machinery that would divide, administer, and, in many ways, define his legacy. For years, he had revised his will with the same thoroughness he applied to a timetable, consulting New York attorneys, trust officers, and clergy. By 1913, the instrument ran to many pages. Contemporary newspapers estimated his estate at roughly $60 million, an almost unimaginable sum then, equivalent to many hundreds of millions today. The will confirmed what insiders already suspected, that Mary Lily, his third wife, would be the principal heir. She received Whitehall and its contents, his northern residences, and, crucially, a controlling interest in the Florida East Coast Railway and the hotel and land companies that surrounded it. His surviving daughter, Jenny Benedict, was provided for through generous trusts and income, as were grandchildren and the descendants of earlier marriages. Flagler also remembered those beyond his immediate family. Substantial sums were directed to Memorial Presbyterian and other churches, to a hospital in St. Rubely, Augustine, and to educational institutions he had supported quietly for years. Longtime secretaries, engineers, and servants received bequests or lifetime annuities, a gesture of feudal loyalty from a man who had governed both boardrooms and rail yards with a paternalistic hand. Yet, when lawyers gathered in New York to read the provisions aloud, the headline fact was unmistakable. Mary Lily emerged as one of the richest women in America. Overnight, the quiet Presbyterian girl from Wilmington was transformed, in the public imagination, into the widow of an empire, custodian of railroads, steamships, town sites, and palaces in coquina and marble. To some, she seemed impossibly fortunate. To others, especially in a world suspicious of great fortunes, she became an emblem of privilege at a time when factory strikes and trust-busting filled the news. For Mary Lily, the transformation felt far less glorious than the headlines promised. She had lost the man who for more than a decade had been companion, guardian, and daily responsibility in that house. In the weeks after the funeral, she shuttled between Wilmington, New York, and Palm Beach, meeting lawyers, bankers, and insistent relatives. A woman schooled in church committees and household accounts now stood, at least on paper, at the head of a sprawling estate. Each choice selling a parcel, funding a mission, refusing a request, seemed to bear the weight of Jobs and of Henry's name. To the public, she was the richest widow in America. In prayer, she was a worried Christian, asking simply what duty required of her. When the lawyers had folded the last copy of Henry Flagler's will and the special trains bearing mourners had returned north, Whitehall settled into a quiet that felt less like luxury than abandonment. The great chandeliers were shrouded, the music room closed. That first winter after his death, there was no season in the old sense, no orchestra in the gallery, no procession of private rail cars, no dinners for 30 under the painted ceilings. Only a reduced household remained to air the rooms and sweep the loggias, while their mistress moved between Palm Beach, New York, and North Carolina, trying to inhabit a life that seemed suddenly too large for one person to fill. In public notices and polite society columns, Mary Lily appeared to glide through her new status. Reporters called her self-possessed and serene, noting her simple black gowns and quiet presence at memorial services and board meetings. She honored Henry's memory with endowments to churches and hospitals, attended to the legal formalities of transferring titles, and continued, in modified form, her winter stays at Whitehall. When she did reopen the house, it was on a smaller scale. Where once there had been an almost continuous parade of house guests, now only a few close friends and relations were invited. The dinner table, designed to accommodate a score of the nation's most prominent figures, might now seat 8 or 10. Socially, Palm Beach continued its whirl around her, the cotillions at the breakers, the luncheons at neighboring cottages, but Mary Lily took her place as an observer more often than as a hostess. Increasingly, her center of gravity shifted north. In New York, she occupied a large but not ostentatious apartment, attended church off Fifth Avenue, and met with lawyers and investment managers in paneled offices downtown. There were trips to Wilmington and Chapel Hill, where Kenan welcomed her in drawing rooms whose worn carpets and familiar hymns recalled simpler days. Yet in every setting, the shadow of the Flagler estate accompanied her. Trustees sought her signature. Bankers sought her confidence. Worthy causes sought her patronage. Even the most affectionate cousins could not entirely separate their view of our Mary from the fortune now attached to her name. Under that strain, her health, never robust, began to falter. The long vigil at Henry's bedside, the months of travel and decision-making that followed, and the quiet ache of grief left their marks in ways not immediately visible to the society photographers. She complained of fluttering in her chest, of a heaviness in her limbs, of stabbing headaches that settled behind the eyes and would not lift for days. Nights brought little rest. Sleep, once an easy refuge, came fitfully, broken by dreams and by the insistent tick of clocks in unfamiliar rooms. Nervous pain gripped her stomach after meals. Physicians summoned in Wilmington, New York, and Palm Beach listened gravely, took her pulse, and reached for the same array of remedies that late Edwardian medicine offered to any patient with the ill-defined but very real diagnosis of nervous exhaustion. Bottles began to gather on her, bedside tables, tonics laced with alcohol and coca, bromide powders to quiet the racing mind, and, above all, preparations of opium and morphine. In those years before the dangers of addiction were widely acknowledged, such drugs were standard tools of a conscientious practitioner. A woman of means and middle age who complained of pain and insomnia almost inevitably found herself with a hypodermic syringe or vials of small white tablets among her personal effects. Mary Lily, dutiful with doctors as with clergy, took what was prescribed. A few drops of laudanum before bed eased the knot in her stomach. A measured injection on particularly bad days dulled the sharpest edges of her grief and let her move through a reception line or a board meeting with the composure the world expected. At first, the relief must have seemed almost miraculous. Here was something that actually worked, when rest and seaside air and gentle lectures about not overtaxing oneself did not. Yet opiates' very effectiveness concealed their trap. Over time, the same dose soothed less. The intervals between doses shortened. Headaches rebounded when the drug wore off, driving her back to the bottle. Physicians of the period did not think in terms of dependence as it is understood now. They saw only a respectable, devout widow of fortune whose nerves were under constant strain, deserving of whatever comfort modern pharmacology could give her. Servants learned to recognize the rhythm of her days, the drawn-withdrawn mornings when pain and low spirits kept her in her room, and the afternoons when the doctor had called and she emerged composed, almost buoyant for an hour or two. Her spiritual life deepened as her body weakened. Letters from these years, where they survive, are full of scriptural references and assurances to worried relatives that the Lord will direct my path. She gave generously to Presbyterian and Episcopal causes, funded church buildings, and corresponded with ministers who urged her to see her wealth as a trust rather than a burden. Yet faith did not entirely still the sense of isolation that crept over her as the decade advanced. The role of beloved third wife had given shape to her days. As the solitary steward of an empire, she felt both exposed and oddly superfluous. An object of curiosity for strangers, and of careful deference for those who depended on her charity or her signature. Around her, a ring of petitioners formed. Some were entirely sincere old friends who worried at the changes they saw in her health, relatives who tried to lighten her days with visits and invitations. Others were more ambiguous. Letters arrived from men she barely knew, praising her virtues and hinting at companionship, from distant cousins seeking loans, from promoters holding out schemes for Florida land or new industries. To a woman raised to see the best in others, it grew steadily harder to distinguish between genuine affection and practiced flattery. In Palm Beach, she could not enter a hotel lobby without feeling eyes follow her, weighing not only her person but the millions that moved in legal lockstep with her. It was into this world a shrinking social circle, a widening field of obligation, and a body increasingly mediated by medication that Robert Worth Bingham stepped. A decade younger than Mary Lily, he came from a very different background. Kentucky farm country rather than Carolina plantations, law offices, and courtrooms, rather than oil fields and rail yards. By the time their paths crossed, Bingham had made a respectable, if not spectacular, career for himself as a Louisville lawyer, city judge, and occasional reform politician. He had married young, lost his first wife in a streetcar accident that left him with children to raise and debts to manage, and nursed ambitions that reached beyond the limits of his practice and municipal salary. Friends described him as intelligent, earnest, and socially astute, a man who could argue an equity case in the morning and charm a drawing room in the evening. Yet beneath that polish lay financial pressures. Investments had not always gone well. Land deals and ventures in new industries had tied up more capital than his income comfortably allowed. Owning a newspaper representing Kentucky on a national stage, these were dreams that required resources he did not yet possess. Like many provincial elites of his generation, he looked north and east for opportunity, cultivating connections in New York and among Southern families who had aligned themselves with new money. How precisely he met Mary Lily has been recounted in more than one version, each colored by the teller's sympathies. Some said that mutual friends introduced them at a northern resort, seeing in the thoughtful Kentucky widower a possible comfort for the lonely Palm Beach widow. Others pointed to business. Flagler Enterprises touched rail and land interests in which Bingham, as a lawyer, had professional cause to be interested. However the first meeting occurred, what followed was a courtship that looked, from a distance, like any other among the well-born. Letters, calls, shared visits at Kenan houses in North Carolina and, discreetly, at Whitehall and in New York. To Mary Lily's intimates, the attraction was understandable. Here was a man closer to her own age than Henry had been, someone who could walk beside her without a cane, talk of current politics as easily as of scripture, and show an attentiveness that went beyond the dutiful care of doctors and attorneys. He listened to her complaints of sleeplessness and pain, of the weight of decisions, and responded not with professional advice but with sympathy. He accompanied her to church, expressed admiration for her philanthropy, and spoke earnestly of building a life together in which her burdens might be shared. To others, particularly among the Kenans in the wider southern circle who'd watched fortunes rise and fall, the match looked more calculated. They noted Bingham's modest means, his stalled career, his quick acceptance of invitations into her world. They worried that in her medicated fatigue and genuine hunger for companionship, she might not see clearly what they believed they could. That access to one of the largest estates in the country would transform any man's prospects. Conversations in Wilmington parlors and New York clubs circled the question without quite naming it. Was this romance or opportunity wearing a courteous face? Outside that closed circle of speculation, the public continued to see only the outline, the serene, well-dressed widow of Palm Beach society, still photographed occasionally on Whitehall's loggia, and the up-and-coming Kentucky judge who appeared at her side with increasing frequency. She remained in newspapers almost untouchable, more symbol than person. But behind the photographs and the carefully worded announcements was a middle-aged woman whose nights were broken, whose pulse was often irregular, whose traveling trunks now carried not just gowns and prayer books, but leather cases of medicines. As the courtship advanced toward engagement and, finally, marriage, those two realities, appearance and vulnerability, drew ever closer together, setting the stage for the final, contested chapter of her life in a darkened Louisville bedroom 4 years after Henry's fall on the stairs. By the autumn of 1916, the question that had hovered over every Kenan gathering for months could no longer be postponed. Would the richest widow in the South marry again, and if so, on what terms? In drawing rooms from Wilmington to Palm Beach, opinions divided. Some saw in Judge Robert Worth Bingham a dignified, suitable companion for a woman who had known too much grief. Others, more blunt, called him a fortune hunter with a good education. In the middle stood Mary Lily herself, longing for a quieter kind of happiness, yet acutely aware that, for her, love could never be simple, not with Flagler money behind her. Within the Kenan clan, reactions mingled family loyalty with social caution. Elderly aunts, remembering the scandal of Henry Flagler's divorce, fretted that a second marriage might invite fresh gossip about their pious niece. Brothers and cousins worried about something more concrete. What would become of the Flagler millions painstakingly directed, by Henry's will, toward Kenan blood and agreed-upon charities? Yet none could bring themselves to forbid what Mary Lily clearly desired. The wedding, when it came, was deliberately modest, a late November ceremony at Liberty Hall in Kenansville, beneath the same live oaks that had sheltered her childhood games, with only family and a few close friends present there. If the vows themselves were simple, the arrangements behind them were anything but. Before the Liberty Hall ceremony, Mary Lily spent long hours in consultation with lawyers from New York and Wilmington, their briefcases full of draft agreements and marked-up copies of her existing will. Henry had left his affairs in order, but marriage would change her legal position overnight, granting a new husband claims that Southern custom and her conscience did not entirely approve. She felt pulled between loyalties, to the dead man whose portrait still hung in her houses, to the Kenan kin who had shared her youth, and to the judge asking for her hand. The instrument that emerged in the weeks before her wedding was an intricate compromise, written in the looping hand of a trust lawyer yet carrying all the weight of her divided affections. Large bequests were earmarked for Kenan relative siblings, nieces, nephews, and cousins, some in outright gifts, others in carefully constructed trusts that would release income over time. Substantial funds were allocated to colleges and schools already dear to the family, with attention to institutions in North Carolina and Florida, where Henry's name had become synonymous with progress. Whitehall and certain northern houses were confirmed as hers for life, to be distributed later within the family according to instructions. For Bingham, the provisions were generous but deliberately constrained. He was to receive a substantial annual income for life, drawn from designated securities and safeguarded against market swings by professional trustees. He would have the right to occupy certain residences while he lived, including, if he wished, Whitehall during the Palm Beach season and whichever northern house she might choose as their primary home. But the principal of the Gray Flagler fortune, the railroad shares, the hotel companies, the broad portfolio of investments was to remain largely intact for ultimate distribution to her kin and charities. A separate prenuptial agreement recorded his formal renunciation of further legal claims thereafter. On paper, the balance looked almost elegant. The Flagler millions would, in time, nourish the family and causes Mary Lily cherished, while the husband at her side would be comfortably supported, yet never in control of the whole. In private, however, nothing felt so neat. To Kenan cousins, the clauses promising Bingham lifetime income confirmed their suspicions that he was gaining more than mere companionship from the match. To Bingham's friends in Kentucky, the prenuptial looked like a humiliating admission that he married on her terms, not his. For Mary Lily, the stack of documents represented something quieter, permission to seek affection without betraying duty as she understood. After the North Carolina wedding, the couple's first journey together was not to Palm Beach but inland, to Louisville, where Bingham's brick house stood on a broad, tree-lined street far removed from the palms and surf of Whitehall. For Mary Lily, arriving with trunks of gowns, cases of medicines, and a retinue of servants, it was a passage into a different kind of prominence. Louisville in the 1910s was a city of bourbon, tobacco, and rail connections, proud of its horse races, but closer in spirit to a large town than to New York. Here, social standing flowed as much from pedigree and politics as from wealth alone. The Bingham household she entered was not an empty stage. Robert brought with him children from his first marriage, still grieving their mother, and wary of this stranger whose portrait had appeared in Eastern newspapers. Mary Lily, who had never had children, tried to win them with Patience furnishings for their rooms, outings to parks, a gentle insistence on shared prayers at night. Outside the family circle, Louisville society responded with a mix of curiosity and calculation. Some matrons welcomed her into committees and club meetings. Others measured the cut of her dresses and the scale of her jewelry, wondering how much Flagler opulence would seep into their streets. Between trips back to North Carolina and seasons at Whitehall, Mary Lily tried to make a home in this new city. She installed familiar pieces from her earlier life photographs of Liberty Hall, bronzes and carpets from Palm Beach softening the Victorian rooms of the Bingham house. She attended church with Robert, sat on the boards of charities he favored, and hosted luncheons where Presbyterian pastors from Wilmington might find themselves seated beside Kentucky judges and newspapermen. Yet the orbit of lawyers and bankers around her did not shrink. Letters bearing New York postmarks arrived weekly, requesting decisions on investments, transfers, and refinements to the intricate machinery of her estate. In Louisville, the strain on her health did not ease. The winters were colder than in Palm Beach, the damp Ohio air hard on a heart already prone to palpitations. New physicians adjusted but did not abandon the regimen of sedatives and opiates begun years earlier. If anything, the doses crept upward as her complaints multiplied. There were bright interlude summer visits from nieces, outings to the races, evenings when she and Robert read aloud in the lamplight, but also days when she remained upstairs, curtains drawn, numbed by medicine and fatigue. At her lawyer's urging, she made revisions to her estate plans, tidying language, clarifying bequests, confirming Bingham's income. Filed in mahogany cabinets and bank vaults, the wills, codicils, and agreements from these years looked perfectly orderly. Every contingency was spelled out, every beneficiary weighed and named, every signature witnessed in neat looping ink. On their face, they promised to keep the peace between Louisville and Wilmington, between Bingham and the Kenans, and perhaps even within Mary Lily's divided heart. But paper could not resolve the anxieties that grew as her health declined, and her dependence on her new husband increased. By the time she fell seriously ill in the summer of 1917, those carefully drafted pages would be read not as protections, but as evidence themselves. The story that would haunt two families and fill courtrooms for years began with something so ordinary it might, under other circumstances, have gone unremarked. In mid-July 1917, during a spell of heavy Louisville heat, 50-year-old Mary Lily Kenan Flagler Bingham complained of an earache. She had been slightly out of sorts for days, tired, pale, restless at night, but an ear infection seemed trivial compared to the heart flutters and nervous pains she knew too well. The Bingham's brick house on South 4th Street went on with its routines, unaware that a final, fateful 13-day vigil had begun for her there. At first she tried home remedies, warm compresses, cotton packing, a little oil, the sorts of measures Southern women had used for generations. When the pain sharpened and a low fever appeared, Bingham sent for their regular physician, a respected Louisville doctor who had treated his first wife and children. The examination seemed reassuring. The ear canal was inflamed, perhaps from a minor infection or poorly healed cold. Rest, simple diet, and powders for pain were ordered. Outwardly, nothing about the situation suggested crisis. The newspapers that week recorded only war headlines and summer heat, not illness in that house. Within a few days, however, the pattern changed. The earache did not ease, it deepened, sending stabbing pains along her jaw and into her neck. She grew nauseated, then began vomiting after meals. The fever climbed. The physician, called back sooner than he expected, now saw a more serious picture, an infection that might be spreading beyond the ear, threatening the mastoid bone or even the delicate tissues near the brain. Stronger medicines were prescribed, including small doses of morphine to quiet the agony and allow her to sleep. A trained nurse was engaged to keep watch at her side. What followed was a seesaw that would later prove maddening to reconstruct. There were hours when the medicine seemed to work. The pain dulled, the fever broke, and she could sit up in bed, talk quietly with Robert, even ask about cousins in Wilmington or business in Palm Beach. Then, often by nightfall, the burning in her ear returned, joined now by cramping in her abdomen and bouts of diarrhea. Each flare brought fresh injections, more powders. Her appetite vanished. The once regal hostess of Whitehall now shrank against her pillows, sweat darkening the linen beneath on those July Kentucky nights. By the end of the first week, her heart had become a central worry. The nurse reported episodes when Mary Lily's pulse raced wildly, then slowed so much she seemed to fade. Short walks across the room left her breathless. The doctor, aware of her long-standing palpitations, spoke now of myocarditis and cardiac weakness, terms that then concealed more than they revealed. His response, in part, was more morphine. Pain, he believed, placed dangerous strain on a failing heart. Relief was not simply kindness, but treatment. Each injection brought a measure of calm, and with it, increasing cloudiness of mind. The cast within that shuttered bedroom grew familiar over the 13 days. There was the attending physician, an experienced man in late middle age whose notes and later testimony provide the clinical spine of what we know. There was the nurse, a trained professional hired for this crisis, moving between bed and medicine cabinet, gauging when distress tipped into agony. There was Bingham himself, sometimes at the bedside, sometimes pacing the adjoining sitting room, summoned whenever she called his name. And there were housemaids and a cook hovering at doorways, catching fragments they would remember years later, if asked under oath. From their overlapping, sometimes contradictory accounts, historians attempt to trace the course of her mind as much as her body. One maid later recalled that Mrs. Ziver Potty, Bingham talked right intelligently whenever the pain eased, asking about flowers in the garden or remarking on the hymn the nurse hummed. The nurse described intervals of confusion, Mary Lily mistaking night for morning or calling out for Henry. The doctor insisted she understood him whenever he discussed medicine. All agreed that morphine shaped those hours, lifting her out of torment yet blurring, in ways no one fully grasped, the edges of awareness for her. Outside the sick room, quieter but equally consequential conversations were taking place. For years, Mary Lily's estate plans had been objects of intense interest among lawyers in New York and relatives in North Carolina. Marriage to Bingham had prompted revisions. Illness now raised grim practical questions. If she died in Louisville, would Kentucky law complicate earlier arrangements? Were her charitable bequests adequately protected? Did her husband feel fairly provided for? We know that Bingham consulted counsel during those days. Telegrams went back and forth, and, eventually, drafts of a new codicil to her will were prepared and brought home to him. The critical moment came late in the illness, when the new codicil was executed at her bedside. In later disputes, witnesses struggled to fix the exact date, but most placed it within the final week, when fever and heart strain were both pronounced. Bingham, the doctor, the nurse, and at least 2 witnesses entered the darkened room. Propped up on pillows, Mary Lily listened as portions of the document were read aloud. Did she follow every clause? The doctor said yes. The nurse was less certain. She took pen in hand or, some claimed, merely guided it weakly across paper. What that signature, firm or faltering, accomplished was clear enough. The codicil increased Bingham's financial stake in her estate, enlarging the income he would receive for life and giving him, in some interpretations, greater discretion over certain investment holdings while still preserving large trusts for Kenan kin and established charities. It did not disinherit her family or erase prior commitments, but it shifted the balance subtly toward Louisville and away from Wilmington. To sympathizers, this looked like a natural gesture of confidence toward a devoted husband. To skeptics, it was the culmination of a calculated courtship, sealed in that room. After the codicil was signed, her decline accelerated. The fever persisted, her pulse grew erratic, periods of lucidity shortened. Morphine, by now administered at regular intervals, wrapped those last days in a haze that made it difficult then and impossible now to say exactly what she understood or felt. On the 13th day, in the early hours of July 27, 1917, her breathing became shallow and finally ceased. The attending physician signed the death certificate citing heart failure and myocarditis, standard phrases that acknowledged both her chronic weakness and the acute strain of infection. The household plunged into necessary arrangements for burial. Speed was part of those arrangements. An undertaker was summoned within hours. Embalming fluid was injected, sealing in whatever chemical traces her tissues then held. The body, dressed in a simple gown, was placed in a polished casket and put on a northbound train to Wilmington, where the Kenans gathered for a funeral at the family church. Publicly, relatives accepted the physician's explanation of sudden heart failure atop chronic disease. Privately, questions surfaced almost at once. Why had her illness been kept so quiet? Why had a new codicil been necessary? And why, some wondered, had burial come so swiftly? In the months that followed, as estate papers were probated and the terms of the codicil became clearer, unease hardened into suspicion. Kenan attorneys reviewing the sequence of drafts and the timing of signatures argued that a woman so ill, so heavily dosed with morphine, could not have given informed consent to a document that so notably increased her husband's share. Rumors, never entirely sourced, added darker possibilities. That morphine, far from being merely palliative, might itself have hastened death. That other poisons could have been involved. Reluctantly, the family requested what few Southern families contemplated: a formal exhumation of Mary. Months after the funeral, under court order, her casket was lifted from the North Carolina earth and opened in the presence of physicians and lawyers. Samples of organs and preserved tissues were taken and shipped to chemists in distant laboratories. Their analyses found morphine in measurable amounts, confirmation that significant quantities had been administered in her final days. But the science of 1917 could not determine with precision when each dose had been given or whether the total crossed the line from heavy medical use into lethality. No other clear-cut poisons were detected. Interpreting those numbers became an argument itself. Medical experts, summoned on both sides, read the same reports and reached opposite conclusions. Some testified that her weakened heart, ravaged by years of disease, might well have failed under the combined assault of infection and pain, regardless of morphine. Others argued that dosages recorded in notes and inferred from tissue levels were reckless at best, fatal at worst. Courts, constrained by the era's limited forensics and by competing narratives of motive, ultimately declined to declare murder. Officially, she remained a woman who died of heart failure and myocarditis. Unofficially, suspicion lingered wherever her name and fortune were spoken still. Legal battles rarely begin with shouting. More often, they start with a letter on heavy paper, carried quietly up the front steps. So it was with the contest over Mary Lily Henry Flagler Bingham's estate. At first, there were only murmurs among the Kenans, questions asked in parlors at Liberty Hall in Wilmington, troubled references to the Louisville doctors, and the uneasy fact of a codicil signed in the shadow of death. For a time, family instinct warred with family pride. The Kenans were not quick to accuse, especially not a woman of their own blood, nor did they lightly drag private sorrow into public view. They had accepted the death certificate's verdict of heart failure and myocarditis with outward decorum, buried Mary Lily beside kin, and tried to reassure themselves that illness, not interference, had carried her off. But documents have a way of stiffening questions into resolve. As lawyers in Wilmington and New York examined the final codicil, executed in a darkened Louisville bedroom only days before her death, they saw provisions that tilted more heavily toward Judge Robert Worth Bingham than earlier drafts had done. More income, wider discretion over investments, broader rights in property taken together. These clauses represented not a tearful indulgence but a deliberate reshaping of a vast estate at the 11th hour. In late 1917, the Kenans made their decision. Through counsel, they filed proceedings in Kentucky to challenge the Codicil and, by implication, Bingham's enlarged share. Officially, the petition spoke the cool language of the law. It alleged that at the time of signing, Mary Lily lacked sound and disposing mind, and that the document was the product of undue influence. Unofficially, the very act of going to court signaled something harsher, that a once trusted husband was now suspected, at least by some, of steering a dying woman's hand. Bingham's response was swift and indignant. He retained prominent Louisville and New York attorneys, men as skilled at managing newspapers as motions, and framed the case not as a dry dispute over instruments but as an attack on the sanctity of marriage. In his telling, a lonely, grief-worn widow had, after careful thought, chosen to increase the provision for the husband who had nursed her and shared her burdens. And now jealous relatives were trying to claw back what simple fairness had granted. Depositions from the attending physician and nurse were marshaled to bolster that story. Both swore that at the moment she signed, whatever the ravages of infection and morphine, Mary Lily knew what she was doing. The Kenans' legal strategy, by contrast, hinged on shadows on what could not be seen clearly in that darkened bedroom. Their attorneys sought to show that morphine and illness had clouded Mary Lily's mind, that she had become dependent on those around her for even simple decisions, and that the last codicil departed so markedly from Henry Flagler's careful blueprint as to be suspect on its face. They summoned servants from Louisville and Palm Beach who recalled her confusion and dependence in her final years, and they pointed to the very need to exhume her body as proof that something in the manner of her dying had been amiss. Yet for all the talk of influence and capacity, the courtroom corridors held another, less legal concern: scandal. The prospect of a full trial with nurses describing hypodermic syringes, chemists testifying about morphine in exhumed organs, and counsel hinting at poison before a public gallery was distasteful to both sides. The Kenans, whatever their doubts about Bingham, valued their own reputation for modesty and probity. Bingham, eager to secure a future in politics and publishing, could ill afford to be cross-examined for days about his dying wife's pain and purse. Behind the formal motions, therefore, ran a subtext of pressure to settle, to translate grief, suspicion, and hurt pride into figures on a ledger. The newspapers, meanwhile, had no such qualms about airing the human drama. In Louisville, the daily press, soon to include the Courier-Journal, which Bingham would later control, reported the filings with a mixture of civic loyalty and guarded distance, emphasizing the judge's local service while acknowledging the sensational aspects of the case. New York papers, less constrained, turned the dispute into a parable of Gilded Age excess. Headlines pitted Flagler millions against Kentucky jurist, and columnists speculated freely about morphine, mystery, and the curse of great wealth. Southern newspapers, closer to the Kenans' home ground, often cast the family as dutiful protectors of a legacy meant for churches and colleges, though a few editorials could not resist the suggestion that country cousins might be as interested in dollars as in duty. Through it all, numbers floated through copy and conversation like incantations. Mary Lily's estate was variously estimated at $60, $70, even $75 million. Bingham's share under the contested codicil might yield him several million more than under the earlier plan. Trusts for Kenan kin, endowments for universities, reserves for hospital work, all were totaled and retotaled as though the exact sum could somehow answer the larger, unquantifiable question of what Mary Lily herself had truly wanted. In conference rooms away from reporters' eyes, negotiation slowly displaced accusation. Attorneys for the Kenans pressed their advantage. They had public sympathy in parts of the South, medical testimony that raised doubts about Mary Lily's lucidity, and, not least, the moral leverage of having consented to exhumation. Bingham's lawyers, for their part, reminded everyone that the earlier, uncontested will already gave him substantial income, that Kentucky juries might look kindly on a local judge, and that a protracted fight would freeze charitable projects the Kenans claimed to champion. Gradually, what each side feared began to outweigh what each hoped to win. The settlement, when it came, was announced in bland, careful phrases. The contested codicil would not go to a full trial. Certain of its provisions would effectively be set aside. In return, Bingham agreed to accept a fixed sum reported at the time as several $1 million, an enormous fortune in itself, along with specified securities and a life interest in particular properties, and to renounce any claim to the lion's share of the estate. The bulk of the Flagler wealth, freed of his expanded claims, would flow as Mary Lily's earlier plans had envisioned to Kenan relatives and to a suite of educational and religious causes. In practical terms, that compromise reshaped two regions. In Louisville, the millions Bingham received made possible his purchase and expansion of the Courier-Journal, transforming him from a local jurist into a newspaper baron whose editorials and endorsements would carry weight across Kentucky and, eventually, in national politics. From those columns, he would promote progressive reforms, shape public opinion in wartime, and build the platform that later led to his appointment as ambassador to the court of St. James's. In North Carolina and at the University of North Carolina in particular, Kenan funds built laboratories, endowed professorships, and underwrote scholarships. In time, entire quadrangles and stadiums would bear the family name, concrete expressions of a legacy both generous and, for those who knew its origins, faintly troubled. On paper, the struggle over Mary Lily's fortune ended in neat ledgers of debits and credits, trusts funded and estates closed. In life, it left quieter scars. Cousins who never again exchanged Christmas letters. Louisville friends who spoke of that lawsuit in lowered voices. Reputations in both camps faintly shadowed by doubt. Even in Palm Beach, where Whitehall's marble columns still gleamed in the sun, visitors remembered her less for music than for mystery and litigation that never quite went away. Long after the court reporters packed away their notebooks and the lawyers filed their settlements, Whitehall still stood on its narrow strip of Palm Beach, staring across Lake Worth as if waiting for footsteps that would never quite return. The house had outlived Henry Flagler. Now it had outlived Mary Lily as well. The litigations over codicils and morphine played out in distant cities. On the island, what mattered was simpler and in some ways harsher. Who would pay to keep 100,000 square feet of marble, plaster, and tile standing against sun, salt, and time? By the terms of her will, Whitehall did not pass to a son or daughter. There were none but to a niece, Louise Clisby Wise, later Mrs. Herbert Lewis. She had known the house as an occasional guest in its glittering years, a place of winter gaiety rather than daily routine. Inheriting it in 1917, she also inherited its expenses. Taxes, insurance, staff wages, repairs after each summer's damp assault. These figures, once background noise in Henry's ledgers, now loomed large for a woman whose own life was centered in New York and whose generation no longer assumed that armies of servants came with the family name. At first, Louise tried to use Whitehall as her uncle had intended, coming down for short seasons, opening a few rooms, entertaining modestly. But the world was changing. The First World War had shifted patterns of travel. Income taxes and new expectations about privacy made the idea of maintaining a palace for a few weeks each year seem less like privilege than burden. In the early 1920s, as Florida's land boom began to roar and speculators circled Palm Beach with plats and blueprints, she accepted what must have been a painful truth. Sentiment alone could not justify such a house. Developers approached with a proposition suited perfectly to the fevered optimism of the decade. They would buy Whitehall and its grounds, keep the great house as a showpiece, and graft onto it a soaring hotel tower that would turn Henry's winter cottage into a commercial resort. In 1924, the deal was done. Title passed to a syndicate, and work began almost at once on a 10-story concrete and stucco annex that rose behind the original Beauart's shell like an ungainly cousin. Elevators, fire stairs, and hundreds of bathrooms were threaded through the new structure, all feeding into the old house's marble heart. When the Whitehall Hotel opened for business, it offered something paradoxical, the intimacy of a private palace repackaged as an attraction. Guests now arrived not as personal invitees but as paying customers, checking in at a reception desk installed in the Grand Hall. The Louis XV drawing room became a public lounge. The Italianate music room echoed with jazz bands and the laughter of flappers twirling in beaded dresses. Where Mary Lily once played hymns for a circle of friends, strangers now danced the foxtrot under the same gilt ceilings, their room keys jangling as they moved between bar and ballroom. For a time, the arrangement seemed to serve both preservation and progress. The house was heated, cleaned, and lit. Its loggias continued to catch sea breezes, now for a wider public. Yet commercial use inevitably left its marks. To meet building codes, partitions were inserted, fire doors added, wiring updated in ways that scarred ornamental plaster. Kitchens designed for a household were expanded to feed hundreds. The quiet gardens gave way to tennis courts and parking areas. From the lagoon, visitors now saw not just Carrere and Hastings' balanced facade, but a looming slab of modern hotel rising behind it, dwarfing the scale Henry had intended. The larger forces that would test this hybrid creation lay far beyond Palm Beach. In 1926, the Florida land boom collapsed, leaving half-finished subdivisions up and down the coast. 2 years later, a devastating hurricane swept Lake Worth and the Barrier Island, battering seawalls and shuttering hotels for repairs. Then, in 1929, Wall Street crashed. The kind of families who had once filled private rail cars to winter at the Royal Ponciana and Whitehall Hotel watched their dividends shrink or vanish. Occupancy fell. Room rates were cut, staff dismissed, maintenance deferred, paint peeled along verandas, carpets in the old house thinned under fewer but harder footsteps. Through the 1930s and into the war years, the Whitehall Hotel survived more by habit than by health. It changed hands. Each new owner promised renovations, but capital was scarce. During the Second World War, travel restrictions and gasoline rationing kept many northern tourists at home. Those who did come to Florida often preferred newer, more efficient hotels or modest motor courts springing up along the highways. By the 1950s, the tower that had once embodied modernity looked tired. Air conditioning units jutted from windows, concrete spalled under the assault of salt and rain. The old mansion at its base, though still impressive, seemed more like an anachronistic lobby than a home. By the 1950s, it would have been easy rational, even to clear the site and replace the aging complex with a new hotel or apartments. Some developers proposed exactly that, but a different idea was taking root in America, that the great showplaces of the Gilded Age, however gaudy, formed part of a shared architectural memory. For Henry Flagler's granddaughter, Jean Flagler Matthews, that memory was also family history. Visiting Palm Beach and seeing her grandfather's wedding gift buried beneath a shabby tower, she felt both reproach and obligation. In the late 1950s, she organized a nonprofit foundation, drew in cousins and local civic leaders, and began complicated negotiations to separate the original mansion from the failing hotel business wrapped around it. Eventually, the foundation acquired Whitehall and a portion of its grounds. The high-rise wing, by then half empty, was condemned and carefully dismantled, floor by floor, until Carrere and Hastings' long-buried elevations were exposed once more. Conservation architects set about stabilizing the shell, then restoring interiors room by room, using old photographs, inventories, and surviving pieces of furniture as their guides. In 1960, Whitehall reopened for another season, this time not as a private residence or as the Whitehall Hotel, but as the Henry Morrison Flagler Museum. Visitors now entered the Grand Hall without invitation cards, buying tickets at a modest desk where a butler had once stood. School groups trailed through the drawing rooms. Retirees studied ceiling frescoes once glimpsed only by Palm Beach's inner circle. To keep the lights on, the museum relied on memberships, grants, and donations, proof that maintaining beauty on this scale had moved from one ledger to another.